Gentlemen, I appreciate all three of you. For all of you are coming from huge metropolitan markets. There's a lot to get to, so I'm going to get right into it. I want to start with you, Chief Godby. Your thoughts on what you see happening in D.C. and whether you would have welcomed the National Guard to help police in your city.
Under the right circumstances, I think any chief will welcome assistance for a crime issue. However, there are span of control issues. There's command and control issues. What's the use of force continuum? What kind of deconfliction is being done between all these people running around with guns in your community? And then last but not least, the local communication between local police, their chief, their agency head, their city. Those relationships are critical to safe communities. So when you trample over those without any kind of consideration, and then not to mention, you are now weakening the ability to respond to foreign threats because now you've utilized your military for something that is not designed for.
Lieutenant Sutton, you are a retired Las Vegas police lieutenant. You spent 34 years on the job. We just heard Maryland Governor Wes Moore talk about how National Guard members are simply not trained as police officers. So what happens from a law enforcement perspective when you're putting hundreds of people who are not trained in local policing in these local communities in this kind of environment?
Well, the issue is that they are not trained as local police, and that the job that they are being given is not to actually enforce laws. The troops that have been deployed in D.C. haven't even been armed up until recently, and I think they're planning to arm them now. But they are not law enforcement officers, and nor should they be treated like that. They're basically being utilized as a method of deterrence, and that's really the only function that they can serve at this point. But the reason behind this is that the law enforcement system has been gutted in many of the cities, including in Chicago and Illinois, with some of the insane laws that have been put into place, like the Safety Act, which has destroyed much of the ability for the police to actually police.
Superintendent Johnson, I want to talk about your city of Chicago in a moment, but first, your reaction to what the other two law enforcement officers are saying.
Well, I think they're good morning and thanks for having me on today. But I think they're right on point. Listen, when you bring your military in who are trained for warfare to conduct law enforcement activities in your home country, then that's a problem. They haven't been trained for those things. So I just think you're creating more problems than you're solving when you're doing it and using methods such as these.
Superintendent, you've seen crime drop in Chicago over the last few years. President Trump has been using that city as an example. With that said, the city doesn't even crack the top 90 when it comes to violent crimes, at least per capita. So what's your reaction as a former police chief in Chicago when you hear the president say that Chicago is unsafe and it's a mess?
You know, he's always done it. You know, while I was superintendent and Rahm Emanuel was the mayor, we would go back and forth with him all the time about that. You know, per capita, Chicago isn't close to the top of the crime list. But perception is reality. And, you know, I hate to say it, he's the president of my country, but he doesn't speak factually in a lot of these instances. So, you know, crime is down across the nation as well as in Chicago, you know, and I think there's something to be said for that without government intervention. So I think he needs to let the local law enforcement officers do what they need to do.
Chief Godby, staying on the subject of law enforcement, the administration talks about the use of the National Guard in two separate ways. The one we're talking about, which crime being a top priority, the other is immigration enforcement, and we've been covering that as our top story today. But if the Guard is in your jurisdiction, does it matter what their mission is, whether it's crime, whether it's helping ICE, when it comes to how they work with local authorities? How does that get handled from the side of local police?
Well, it absolutely matters, Hena, and I'm sure my comrades would agree. And again, from a local control standpoint, the feds, they can jump in, but when they leave, we're left to deal with a community that has been dealt with in a way that is not as tender as need to be. Now, I know people think that's soft language, but the reality is these relationships take years to build. And once you've built trust with the community, then that's important. And if I could say this very briefly, and it can't be politicized, even though Chicago has been mentioned, unfortunately, my city, which I love, if you look at 2024 crime stats, we're number 3 in the nation of Part 1 crimes per 100,000 residents in the violent crimes category. However, Mayor Mike Duggan gave a shout out to President Trump. and Detroit has not been mentioned in that list. So this is really not about numbers. It's about who has favor with the current president.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe below and download our NewsNation app right now on your phone, and you will get fact-based, unbiased news for all Americans.